Suffering is one of the most uncomfortable experiences a human being can go through. Yet, it remains one of the most consistent forces behind personal growth. People rarely choose pain willingly, and when it arrives, it often feels meaningless, unfair, and overwhelming. But over time, many notice a strange pattern. Difficulty is often followed by deep internal change. It is as if suffering removes something unnecessary, leaving a version of them that sees life more clearly. Comfort tends to preserve the self rather than transform it. When life is easy, there is little pressure to question. A person can remain unchanged for years because nothing forces them to confront weaknesses or fears. Suffering disrupts stability by breaking routines, shattering expectations, and forcing attention onto ignored parts of life. In this disruption, people are pushed into reflection, whether they want to or not, because avoidance no longer works. One way suffering leads to growth is by exposing illusions about control, security, and permanence in life. Many believe if they act correctly, plan carefully, they can prevent most forms of loss or failure. But painful experiences show that life does not always respond predictably, and outcomes are never guaranteed. This realization, while painful, often becomes the foundation of humility and emotional maturity. Suffering also forces people to confront themselves in ways comfort rarely allows, especially when distractions are stripped away. When dealing with heartbreak, failure, or grief, they turn inward because the outside world no longer provides stability. In that inward turn, they notice thoughts, habits, and emotional patterns previously hidden beneath daily busyness. This self-awareness can be uncomfortable, but it becomes the starting point for meaningful change. Suffering strengthens emotional endurance by expanding what a person believes they can survive. Before hardship, people often underestimate their resilience, assuming certain experiences would completely break them. But when those experiences happen, they discover they can endure far more pain, uncertainty, and loss than expected. This discovery reshapes self-perception, replacing fragile identity with a quieter but stronger confidence. Suffering also deepens empathy, because people who have experienced pain recognize it more easily in others. Someone who has faced rejection understands subtle signs of insecurity without needing detailed explanations. A person who has grieved deeply becomes more patient with silence and emotional distance. This increased sensitivity is not learned from theory, but from direct experience of what emotional pain feels like. Growth through suffering also happens because pain often destroys unrealistic expectations about life. Many enter adulthood assuming effort will always be rewarded and good intentions guarantee positive outcomes. But repeated disappointment forces a recalibration of expectations, replacing idealism with a grounded understanding. This shift can be disorienting, but it often leads to better decision-making and fewer emotional crashes. Failure is one of the most common forms of suffering that leads to growth, especially when it challenges ego. When someone fails after investing time, energy, and identity, it forces them to reassess their approach. At first, failure feels like inadequacy, but with reflection, it becomes information about what needs to be improved. This transformation from emotional defeat into practical learning is a clear example of growth from suffering. Loneliness is another form of suffering that often leads to deep internal development. When external validation is absent, people are left alone with thoughts and emotional dependencies. This forced solitude can reveal uncomfortable truths about self-worth and attachment. Over time, however, it can also build independence and a stable sense of identity. Heartbreak plays a similar role by breaking emotional attachments that once felt permanent. The end of a meaningful connection often creates emotional pain that cannot be resolved quickly. But as time passes, individuals gain clarity about patterns and emotional needs. This understanding helps them form healthier relationships in the future, built on awareness. Suffering also teaches patience, removing the illusion that everything can be fixed immediately. Some experiences cannot be rushed, healed, or solved quickly, no matter how badly one wants resolution. This forces acceptance of slower emotional processes, where healing happens gradually. Patience developed through suffering often becomes a long-term strength for future challenges. However, suffering does not automatically guarantee growth. Pain can also lead to bitterness or withdrawal. Some respond to hardship by closing themselves off, avoiding vulnerability, and rejecting trust. In these cases, suffering limits growth because reflection and processing are absent. Growth only emerges when pain is acknowledged, understood, and integrated rather than suppressed. Another important aspect of suffering is that it often reshapes priorities by making people question what truly matters. During comfortable periods, individuals may focus heavily on status, achievement, and external validation. But after experiencing loss or hardship, many begin to value presence, relationships, health, and meaning. This shift in priorities is one of the most lasting forms of growth that suffering can create. Suffering also creates depth of character because it forces people to sit with uncomfortable emotions. Modern life often encourages distraction to avoid emotional discomfort whenever possible. But pain interrupts this cycle and forces individuals to process emotions directly. This emotional processing builds psychological strength and clarity that cannot be developed through avoidance. There is also a kind of honesty that suffering brings, stripping away superficial roles and social performance. When someone is in pain, they often stop caring about appearing perfect and focus more on authenticity. This reduction of ego creates space for genuine self-understanding, where identity is shaped by experience. In this space, people discover parts of themselves they had never acknowledged during times of comfort. Suffering ultimately leads to growth because it forces transformation, and transformation rarely happens without discomfort. Human beings tend to remain the same until staying the same becomes more painful than changing. Pain pushes that threshold, making growth not just an option, but often a necessity for emotional survival. Through this process, suffering becomes not only something endured, but something that reshapes how a person understands life itself.